Hello, I'm Matt Sparks from the Fan Blitz Network, and this is your NFL Weekly Newsflash. So, it's January 26, 2024, and we have games coming up this Sunday. In fact, this is going to be the last time of the year that we can say games in reference to the NFL season. We got the AFC Championship, we got the NFC Championship, and we have a whole slew of head coaching moves besides. So, let's get to it. First, we're going to preview the AFC Championship. We have the Kansas City Chiefs going to their 6th consecutive AFC Championship, but this time it's not in Arrowhead like it normally is, and they are headed to Baltimore to face off against the Baltimore Ravens. Lamar Jackson versus Pat Mahomes. It promises to be quite the matchup. So, let's get into it. Some of the key matchups we're watching in this game is going to be the Chiefs' offensive line versus the Ravens' defensive line. So that Chiefs' offensive line, it's taken some hits in the past few weeks, right? Wanya Morris, the rookie, was starting for Kansas City. Wanya is out. Donovan Smith is likely to fill that role once again. And then on the interior, which is going to be so important, Joe Thuney, who is also the emergency left tackle but is the starting left guard, is out as well after suffering that pectoral injury last week against the Bills. And so, with Joe Thuney out, his replacement will be Nick Allegretti, who we talked to on our show. For more on that, go look at our YouTube page under Chillin' with Chiefs. Nick Allegretti, road grader as a run blocker, not as great as a pass blocker. So, aside from that, you have the all-pro center Creed Humphrey, and you have the very good right guard from Tennessee, Trey Smith, right? On that Ravens defensive line, they're pretty stout as well. You got Justin Madubuike, who has double-digit sacks as a defensive lineman this year. You have Michael Pierce, who had a bit of a lull in his career a couple years back, but has really come back from that to be a solid defensive lineman. And then you have Brent Urban, who's been a solid veteran for the Ravens for quite a while now. So how is this matchup going to go? It's all going to depend on that interior, I believe. And what I mean by that is it's going to depend on how Nick Allegretti does in replacement of Joe Thuney. It's going to revolve around, is he able to mesh well with Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith? So that interior offensive line is going to be oh so important against a Ravens defensive front that has been absolutely dominant this year. And of course, the Ravens offensive line will have its hands full too with a group of Chiefs defenders, right? Chris Jones in the middle. Derek Hnati actually out this game, but Chris Jones still manning the middle. Charles Omenihu on one side and George Karlaftis on the other, who have been a dominant force as well. So it will be interesting watching what is a very potent Ravens offense guided by Lamar Jackson and Zay Flowers and Odell Beckham Jr., watching them work against this Chiefs defense who has been tight all year, has not allowed over 30 points in a game. And then the Chiefs offense, which has struggled to find its footing at times, but has really picked it up in the last 2 weeks. It's going to be interesting to see them going against this Ravens defense, which is a little banged up on its side, right? In addition, we have a rookie wide receiver comparison. Both the Chiefs and the Ravens drafted rookie wide receivers, and I just want to go through some of these similar numbers. Zay Flowers, first-round pick. Rashee Rice, a second-round pick. Zay Flowers, a very shifty guy. Rashee Rice is very much a catch-and-run type of guy. And so they both played 16 games, right? They both topped 800 yards. In Rashee Rice's case, he actually got over 900 yards, surpassing Juju Smith-Schuster's numbers from last year in Kansas City. And Rashee Rice ended up with 7 touchdowns. Zay Flowers ended up with 9 touchdowns. Rashee Rice ended up with 79 receptions. Zay Flowers ended up with 77 receptions. And then Rashee Rice ends up with a slight advantage in yards per catch at 11.9 as compared to Zay Flowers' 11.1. But it's obvious that both the Chiefs and the Ravens have found a key piece of what was really just wide receiver units with a lot of questions going into this year. So it's going to be interesting seeing how much these guys are worked into the offenses. And of course, both of them are going to be going against excellent defensive backs on the other side. Another storyline to be watching is it's the 2022 MVP, Pat Mahomes, who became the first quarterback in quite a while since Kurt Warner to win the MVP and the Super Bowl in the same year. And then he's going against the presumptive 2023 MVP on the other side. Lamar Jackson considered very likely to win that Most Valuable Player award for the 2023 season. And so it's going to be interesting watching these guys work together. Of course, Lamar would be vying for his second MVP there, and Mahomes has already gotten to MVPs. So these guys are very evenly matched, right? Mahomes is an excellent passer with above average running ability. Lamar Jackson is an excellent runner with above average passing ability. It's going to really be something to watch. So, let's cut to the chase. My official prediction on this, the Chiefs 28, the Ravens 21. I think there will be plenty of scoring here, but those defenses are going to tighten up when it matters, and neither team is going to cross 30, even though they both have a plethora of weapons. So, now let's head over to the other side and the NFC Championship, right? That's Detroit, who hasn't been to this spot in a very, very long time, against San Francisco, who has basically lived in the playoffs the past few years. So, a storyline to watch there. I don't know if this has ever happened before, but Jared Goff, the first overall pick, will be going up against Brock Purdy, the last overall pick. And so the two quarterbacks matched up will be the first overall pick and the last overall pick. I don't know if we've ever had that happen, a first overall pick going against a Mr. Irrelevant, but it'll absolutely be something awesome to see. In addition, they have similarly built teams, except Detroit's a little younger, right? So, San Francisco has Christian McCaffrey, who's an excellent pass-catching running back and an excellent runner between the tackles. And then they have excellent tight end George Kittle. Well, on the other side, Detroit has Jahmyr Gibbs, who's an excellent running back as well, excellent catching. And then they have rookie Sam Laporta. So Detroit, a bit younger team here, so they have the advantage of youth and stamina while having these excellent players. But San Francisco has more experience in this area, more experience in the playoffs. And remember, they seemed like they were on their way to winning against the Eagles last year, or they seemed like they were likely to win against the Eagles last year, except Brock Purdy went down, and then Josh Johnson went down, and Christian McCaffrey had to finish that game out at quarterback. So, not exactly the ideal scenario. If everybody stays healthy in this one, this is going to be a heck of a game to watch, but I'm going to give the slight edge to San Francisco, specifically because they have more experience in this area and they got the veterans. I'm going to go San Francisco. I'm going to go San Francisco 31, and I'm going to go Lions 28. So, San Francisco is going to win it by a field goal. Jake Moody is really going to get a chance to stamp his name on history here. So, let's head to the next big thing, right? We're headed towards the offseason, and there's going to be a lot of free agent players, but we've been dealing with free agent coaches in the run-up to this AFC-NFC Championship weekend. So, let's recap some of the moves there. We have Bengals offensive coordinator Brian Callahan headed to the Titans to be their head coach after they dismissed Mike Vrabel, who was a very successful head coach in Tennessee, but now he's out. Callahan's in, and they're hoping Callahan can get the most out of young quarterback who was a rookie this year, Will Levis. So we'll see what he can do. Of course, they promoted their quarterbacks coach in Cincinnati to replace him, so Cincinnati already has their offensive coordinator replacement. Buccaneers offensive coordinator Dave Canales, who worked so well with Geno Smith last year and then worked really well with Baker Mayfield this year, resurrecting quarterbacks' careers. He's headed over to the Panthers to hopefully get something out of Bryce Young. So what we're seeing early on is two offensive coordinators that are expected to elevate QB play that really kind of slacked off this year from two guys who were rookies this year. As for the Buccaneers, they've interviewed a few people for their offensive coordinator position. One of the interviews they're bringing in is Ken Dorsey, the former Bills offensive coordinator. So we'll see how that goes. Next up, we have the Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris making his return to the Falcons, where he served as the interim head coach, and returning to the same division where he coached the Bucks before as head coach. So he was the defensive coordinator under Dan Quinn. He was the assistant head coach under Dan Quinn when Dan Quinn was the head coach of the Falcons. And then he gets dismissed. He goes over to the Rams, makes a new name for himself as a defensive coordinator once again, and now he's back in the head coaching seat for the Falcons. So this is quite the moment for them. I think that's a really slam dunk hire. I'm glad the Falcons did not make a super splash move. I would have liked to see them go after Bill Belichick, but ultimately I think this move will work out well too. Former Michigan head coach who just won a national championship, and former 49ers head coach who played against his brother in the Super Bowl, Jim Harbaugh, former Saved by the Bell, the new class star, right? Jim Harbaugh is headed to the AFC West and the LA Chargers, right? So if you're keeping track, we now have Andy Reid, Sean Payton, and Jim Harbaugh in the AFC West. And don't discount Antonio Pierce either, who's the next person we're going to be talking about, because interim head coach Antonio Pierce, who took over for Josh McDaniels after he was fired mid-season and served as a steadying hand at the wheel, he did really well in relief. Didn't quite do as good as Rich Bisaccia, who took them to the playoffs, but he gets that full-time job after being the interim head coach there. So he's going to be with the Raiders after McDaniels is out, right? And if Bill Belichick does end up getting a head coaching job, that's not certain at all, right? But if Bill Belichick does end up getting a head coaching job, it's expected that McDaniels might join him there. Speaking of Bill Belichick, the guy that's replacing him is de facto Patriots defensive coordinator Gerard Mayo, and so now they're in the process of building a staff for Gerard Mayo. So that's going to be important to watch going forward. I think Gerard Mayo is the right choice there, right? He knows the organization. He's been around Belichick for a number of years, and he's probably not going to have as much personnel control as Bill Belichick had, which, while Bill Belichick was a great coach, right, he wasn't always the best general manager. So, coaching job's still open. The Seahawks is still open, and the Commanders is still open. Now, the Seahawks and Commanders have both interviewed a couple of familiar faces. The Commanders interviewing assistant head coach and offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy, and the Seahawks interviewing their former defensive coordinator Dan Quinn after they dismissed Pete Carroll. Of course, Ron Rivera getting dismissed from the Commanders, and Ron Rivera getting a few looks as a potential defensive coordinator too. So if I'm looking at fits for these head coaching jobs, I would really like to see Eric Bieniemy go to the Seahawks, but it doesn't look like they have the interest at this point. So it's looking like Dan Quinn is the most likely candidate there in Seattle. And then on the other side for the Commanders, it's looking like Eric Bieniemy, Bobby Slowick, and a few others. Bobby Slowick, of course, the offensive coordinator who is credited with doing so much good work with C.J. Stroud this year for the Texans. It's looking like him, Eric Bieniemy, and a few other candidates are in the mix for that, right? And of course, there's lots of offensive coordinator interviews going around, right? Las Vegas is interviewing a bunch of different offensive coordinators, like former Bears offensive coordinator Luke Getsy, former Browns offensive coordinator Alex Van Pelt, and then the Browns and the Buccaneers and the Eagles are all doing interviews for offensive coordinator. Of course, the Eagles, after they fired their offensive coordinator, Brian Johnson. So, that is about all we have today. This has been your NFL live update from NFL Fan Blitz. We'll see you next week. So, we're back, and as part of your NFL Weekly Newsflash, we are headed into the offseason. We are getting close, just a few weeks away from when the last couple of teams will be signing futures deals. And then, of course, in March is when free agency is going to open, and it's going to be an absolute madhouse with all the free agents available. So, with that in mind, we wanted to look at some of the free agent needs for each team going into the offseason. So, first, we're going to start with the AFC West. We're talking about the Los Angeles Chargers. The Los Angeles Chargers have a lot of cap space tied up in wide receiver, so much so that they might have to make some cuts. If they do, they're going to have to go cheaper with some veteran wide receivers with experience just to be able to round out their room. Now, they're going to have guys like Josh Palmer that are probably going to hang around. They're going to have guys like Darius Davis that are still going to be there. And they might be able to keep one out of either Mike Williams or Keenan Allen, and that's probably going to be decided later. Or they can get one of those guys on a potentially renegotiated deal. But there's no doubt that there is going to be a need at wide receiver going forward for the Los Angeles Chargers. I think that's going to be their biggest need going into the offseason is for a cheap veteran wide receiver. Now, who's that going to be? There's guys out there. There's going to be Kendrick Bourne, potentially Josh Reynolds ends up as a cap casualty, and a few other guys as well, maybe a Tyler Boyd, right? So, as we go forward, keep these receivers' names in mind because Los Angeles is not the only team in the AFC West that's going to be needing receivers. Another one of these is this team right behind me. Kansas City has struggled at wide receiver this year, and they're going to need wide receivers, and they're going to need to look at some defensive tackles. So at wide receivers, some of the guys we just mentioned will be looked at for wide receiver in Kansas City. Of course, they really couldn't find any consistent production at the wide receiver position outside of maybe Rashee Rice and Justin Watson in spots. Other guys struggled with drops, struggled with not being in the right place, struggled with communication, all kinds of stuff. So Kansas City has a major need at wide receiver, but they have Chris Jones likely departing this year. Of course, the All-Pro Chris Jones will have to be replaced somewhere. And you can't replace Chris Jones one for one, but you can get a guy who hopefully can come in and be effective, right? So Charles Omenihu, first and foremost, who the Chiefs signed this offseason, he can move inside and play some of that defensive tackle position if needed, but he's not going to be Chris Jones. You're going to need somebody else to help make up for that, and you have Derek Nottie leaving this offseason potentially. So who do you bring in? Well, there's a few guys out there. There's Poona Ford, who would be a very low-end addition. There's Jaron Reed in Seattle, who might find himself as a cap casualty. There's Tim Settle out of Buffalo, right? There are a few guys, but the guy I really like for Kansas City is a very old veteran, a guy whose name you might not have thought about in a while, but who is playing excellent ball with the Tennessee Titans, and that's Denico Autry. As an interior defensive lineman, Denico Autry has been excellent, but he's been extra excellent this year with 11.5 sacks at age 32. It has truly just been a wonder to watch him get almost more effective and set career highs in sacks and pressures in his age 32 season. So I want Kansas City to look in that direction, and of course, I want them to look at some of those wide receivers we discussed, guys like Kendrick Bourne, guys like Tyler Boyd, guys like potentially a high-end addition like Mike Evans, right, like T. Higgins, but it's very likely that they're going to need one or two veteran receivers, a high-end one and a mid-level one, and then they're going to need a guy in the draft as well, right? So let's move on to the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos find themselves with a good amount of cap and uncertainty tied up in the wide receiver position, but that's not where they need to be looking. No. So the Denver Broncos need to be looking for some juice in the pass rush, right? So the pass rush has been fine, but they've had guys get hurt, and so they need some depth there. They tried out Frank Clark. They tried out Randy Gregory. These really didn't work, and so they got to find something there this offseason. Now, there's another number of decent pass rushers going to be available. I would look for them to add somebody like Yannick Ngakoue. I think Yannick Ngakoue would be a good addition for him. He had a bit of a down year this year, but I really don't see him having 2 down years in a row. I expect him to come back with like 7 or 8 sacks next year, so we'll see how that goes. And then, of course, Denver still needs to be looking around trying to find their quarterback of the future, right? Russell Wilson got benched because of injury guarantee. Jared Stidham probably not the guy, right? They have a big need to fill there, but there's no Aaron Rodgers coming to the rescue anymore. There's no glimmer of hope for a trade or anything like that. So they're really going to have to be looking in the draft, or they're going to have to pull a hell of a value out of free agency. And then finally we get to the Raiders. The Raiders need help everywhere, right? But the good news is they have a solid defensive mind at their head coaching position in Antonio Pierce, right? So the Raiders probably also need to take a look at wide receiver, just a little bit. next offseason. They need to take a look at defensive tackle, right? They need to take a look at defensive backs because this Raiders roster has holes everywhere. They have a lot of veterans starting on that offensive line, right, that, can't be relied upon going forward. They have Greg Van Roten, who was like a 16-game starter this year, and Jermaine Illuminor. He started a lot of games this year. They're both going to be gone, so they're going to have to pick up somebody out of free agency to help with that. There's guys like Dalton Reisner available. There's tackles like Riley Reef available, but you're just trading out one old tackle for another old tackle. Maybe they re-sign. I'm not sure, but that offensive line is definitely a need going into this offseason. Heading over to the AFC East. The AFC East, the Patriots need something at wide receiver, and they damn sure need something at quarterback too, because what we've seen this year is that Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi, they're not the answer. So the Patriots are going to have to look elsewhere for a quarterback, as they haven't had a solid guy since Tom Brady left. And new head coach Gerard Mayo needs to get that position taken care of early. So that's going to be something to look at going forward. Do they pursue a veteran like Kirk Cousins? Do they try to grab a guy out of the draft? Do they trade up? We're going to see, because Bill Belichick, for the first time in, 25 years, 24 years, he's not running the show there, and he's not running the personnel decisions there. So it's going to be interesting to look at going forward. How are these personnel decisions going to differ from the Patriots teams we've seen in the past? For the Jets, that Aaron Rodgers experiment went real well, didn't it? So Aaron Rodgers gets hurt early, proceeds to make an ass of himself all season. But Aaron Rodgers, hopefully has that quarterback position solidified going into next year. But the problem is they brought in all his buddies, and now they don't have a solid wide receiver rotation. So look for them to pursue a veteran wide receiver. Look for them to try to address defense some more, because they already got a good defense. They want to make it even better. And look for them to address that offensive line. Mekhi Becton, a free agent. Dwayne Brown, also a free agent. So they're going to have to look at both tackle positions heading into the offseason. I don't know if either one of those guys gets re-signed, because neither one of them was just excellent, right? Dwayne Brown got hurt. Mekhi Becton allowed a lot of sacks. So, looking forward to the offseason. Where do they go? If Andrew Wiley finds himself as a cap casualty in Washington, do they try to go there for a guy that's solid but not really great? We'll see. Let's see. The Buffalo Bills, right? The Buffalo Bills, they got to figure out who they're going to hire as an offensive coordinator first. Did Joe Brady do enough to earn that position? In the Bills' mind, we'll see how that goes going forward. Also, they're going to have to look at a couple of positions. Gabe Davis is leaving this offseason, so we might see them look for a veteran receiver, right? Tim Settle and Poona Ford are leaving off that defensive line, so we might see them try to look for a tackle at some point, although I think they'll address that in the draft, right? So there's a couple positions there. Nothing too insanely dire at the moment, right? But the Buffalo Bills always need to be trying to get better, because they haven't taken that next step yet. So, the Dolphins, right? The Dolphins are looking pretty good. They've lost some at defensive tackle, right? They have some free agents at defensive tackle. So we'll see if they invest any resources there in free agency. You'd also like to see them get some insurance at running back for Devon Achane, who was hurt for a good portion of this year. And then, of course, Raheem Mostert, who, although he had a career year, man, he's getting up there in age. He's going to be 32 next season. So you'd like to see them potentially get some veteran insurance there. And, of course, keep tinkering with that offensive line. Speaking of offensive lines, let's head to the AFC North, where the Browns need to invest in the offensive line. The defense is great, carried them all year. I think they should roll with Joe Flacco as the starting quarterback heading into next year. But they really need to do something about that offensive line, get some more depth there, right? They were lucky it didn't just completely collapse after Jerron Christian, free agent off the street, was having to start significant games at left tackle for them this year. So it's going to be worth looking at going forward to see what they do for that offensive line. For the Ravens, right, the Ravens need to continue to add at wide receiver, and they need to focus on re-signing their star defensive lineman, Justin Madubuike. And so they need a solid draft, but they also need a solid free agent class, right? They're going to need to add at wide receiver, right? Odell Beckham Jr.'s glory days are probably behind him, right? And so it's like Zay Flowers and a couple other guys. Nelson Aguilar's a free agent, so we'll see what they do there. We want to see them go after some free agents. And then the Steelers probably need to look into quarterback. Are they going to re-sign Mason Rudolph? Are they going to bring in another veteran? Are they going to draft a guy? Do they believe in Kenny Pickett? I mean, we'll see all that going forward, but quarterback needs some investment, right? And then just invest in the offensive line and depth on defense, right? Because you want to solidify your areas so your quarterback doesn't have to do everything by themselves. The Bengals are set up pretty well, but they're losing both Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins potentially this offseason. So they really need to put the hammer down on finding good replacement wide receivers. One of those is probably going to be in the draft. But do they believe in a guy like Andre Iosivas, right, to step up? We're going to see, and I think their free agency decisions are going to tell us a lot about how much they believe in the guys still on their roster. Of course, they still have Jamar Chase, right, who's going to be your number one no matter what. But losing T. Higgins is a big blow. Losing Tyler Boyd is a big blow. Do we see them go after another guy? They're also losing Irv Smith Jr. Do we see them go after a tight end in free agency? Those are two big needs there. So, heading to the South, the AFC South, right? The Titans are losing Derrick Henry, so you'd like to see them bring in some veteran insurance at running back. You would always like to see them invest more in that offensive line, see them invest in that defensive line too, as one of their top sackers, Danico Autry, he's going to be heading into free agency. For the Colts, right, you are potentially losing a couple of guys, right? You're potentially losing Michael Pittman, so you're going to have to invest in wide receiver, whether that's in free agency or the draft. That's a need, right? For the Texans, oh man, the Texans have done pretty good this year, but once again, it's that wide receiver spot they need to invest in. They probably need to invest a signing in corner as well. Continue to invest in that offensive line if you can to make it better, to really solidify things around CJ Stroud. So heading to the NFC West, right, we have the San Francisco 49ers who are playing for a championship this week, right, an NFC championship this week. They don't have a lot of holes on the roster, but, you know, they still got a few guys becoming free agents. Of course, they could always use more investment at wide receiver. They've been fairly good at draft and develop, right? With Kittle missing some games, you wonder if they're going to invest a little bit in tight end. And then, of course, you always want to have a solid backup quarterback. They have Sam Darnold right now, right? I'm curious to see if they want to make sure he sticks around. For the Rams, right? The Rams are pretty well set. They had a really good draft, and another really good draft could set this team up to be an actual contender, right? So they don't have just a lot of holes, but you would like to really see them focus on depth, and you want to see them replace their offensive linemen that are going into free agency because they got a couple of them. Let's see. The Seahawks need to look and see if there's any quarterbacks available this offseason, right? Geno Smith has done an admirable job reviving his career, but if you see an upgrade out there, you really want to get it before you waste some of the years of talent of these guys on defense and waste your last few years of Tyler Lockett and waste your prime of DK Metcalf and JSN. So, we'll see how that goes going forward. I want to see them invest in the tight end position a little bit because Noah Fant might be moving on this offseason. The Cardinals have holes everywhere. They need to invest at wide receiver. They need to invest in the offensive line. They probably need to invest in a backup quarterback. They need to invest picks on defense, right? All over, right? The Cardinals were one of the worst teams in football this year. They need to invest everywhere they can, right? And a lot of that's going to come in free agency. Some of it's going to come in the draft. It's not going to be an immediate turnaround, I don't think, right? Teams have surprised me before. But I don't think it's going to be an immediate turnaround, but they need to do something. NFC East, the Cowboys, right? The Cowboys need to continue to invest picks in the offensive line, continue to invest picks in the defensive line, continue to invest signings there too, right? These are places where the Cowboys have seen a good bit of turnover, a good bit of injuries, right? So you want to get depth in those positions so they can fill that, right? You have 2 running backs going into free agency for the Cowboys. You want to see them bring in somebody to replace that production if they're not going to re-sign Tony Pollard, right? The Giants, right? You want to see the Giants bring in a high-end veteran backup, right, at quarterback because they've had injuries, man. You want to see them invest heavily in that offensive line in free agency and the draft. And then you're going to need to see them invest at wide receiver again because they have a number of wide receivers becoming free agents. Guys like Sterling Shepard and Paris Campbell, maybe Darius Slayton might not be sticking around. So those are the places they need to invest. I know we've been saying wide receiver, but it seems like there's so many veteran wide receivers this year, and it's an excellent wide receiver draft that it just makes free agency so unpredictable for wide receivers. The Commanders have a lot of holes. They need to invest in the pass rush, man. They shipped off 2 veteran pass rushers in Chase Young and Montez Sweat, right? Montez Sweat going to the Bears, Chase Young going to the 49ers. So the Commanders need to rebuild that defense for whoever's coming in to be the head coach, and it starts with the pass rush. For the Eagles, right? The Eagles could stand to bolster their running back room a little bit. You wonder what DeAndre Swift's free agent market is going to be, right? So you want to see them add somebody there. You want to see them continue to invest in that offensive line with Jason Kelce most likely retiring, right? You want to get somebody to make sure that offensive line stays up to snuff, and that if you can do the tush push next year, that you have the personnel to do it. It's everybody from the East, right? Yeah. So let's go to the North, the NFC North. The Bears, kind of like the Cardinals, they have a lot of holes. They could stand some investment at wide receiver. Darnell Mooney's probably headed out the door, right? They could stand some investment potentially at running back. They could stand investment in a backup quarterback. Do they go Caleb Williams? Do they stick with Justin Fields? That's all going to decide how that plays out, right? They could stand with some investment in the pass rush. Yannick Ngakoue headed to free agency. So they got a few positions they can address in the draft or in free agency also. In Green Bay, right? Green Bay they are set up really well. They have a very young team, especially on offense, right? But just bringing in a few more veterans might not be a bad idea. Maybe bringing in a backup quarterback. Do you really trust Sean Clifford if Jordan Love struggles or if Jordan Love, goes down? Just bringing in some insurance in places, right, to make sure you stay a playoff team next year. The Lions, right? The Lions are set up pretty well. They might have to make some hard cap decisions next year. But if they do, right, expect them to pursue low-cost veterans to round out their roster in the pass rush, round out their roster and the wide receiver room, places like that. The Vikings, right? The Vikings are going to need to look somewhere at quarterback, whether that's the draft or free agency. But Kirk Cousins is free agent this offseason, expected to be the top free agent quarterback available. So we'll see what happens with him. But it's possible he might move on. If he moves on, right, they're definitely going to need to invest at quarterback. He was injured this year. They rolled with Josh Dobbs, and then they rolled with Jaron Hall, and then, yeah. So it's been a ride there. For the NFC South, the Buccaneers are going to need to focus on re-signing Baker Mayfield or getting another veteran quarterback, right? They're going to need to focus on wide receiver, whether that's re-signing Mike Evans or investing in another veteran wide receiver or getting a guy in the draft. And then they could stand to throw a couple picks at the offensive line as well with Ryan Jensen being a free agent. They did well without him this year, right, as he went down due to injury, but you never want to be caught with your pants down, so to speak, in a wide receiver position. Of course, Raheem Morris, the new head coach in Atlanta, right? So Atlanta wants to continue to bolster that defense. They probably need to look for a veteran quarterback to run the show there, in addition to any quarterback they might draft later on, right? You don't want to go into the year with only Desmond Ridder as the guy. Yeah. So, they get everybody? The Panthers, of course. The Panthers got a lot of veterans, right? They got a lot of older fellas. They got DJ Chark hitting free agency. They need to invest in some wide receivers. I don't know, man. They need to invest in a lot of places, right? It seems like they have a decent roster, but they just weren't able to compete this year. If they want Dave Canales to be successful, right, they're going to need to invest a lot in free agency and the draft. So, that is your NFL offseason needs. We're rooting for all these new head coaches in their new destinations, so we'll see how it goes. We'll be back next week with your NFL Weekly Newsflash. I'm your host,